She was 8 years old when she opened the door. It was Christmas Eve. She expected Santa Claus. Instead, she met a man carrying 4 handguns and a homemade flamethrower. In the next 9 minutes, a family that had gathered for love, laughter, and tradition would be erased. This is the story of one of the most brutal holiday massacres in modern American history. A story about rage disguised as innocence, about a man who walked into a Christmas party dressed as Santa and brought hell with him. This is the Covina Christmas Massacre. This is the night a man named Bruce Jeffrey Pardo became known as the Santa Claus Killer. She was only 8 years old when she opened the door. It was Christmas Eve. She expected Santa Claus. Instead, she met a man carrying 4 handguns and a homemade flamethrower disguised as a gift. In 9 minutes, everything her family had built over generations, their traditions, their memories, their identity, would be swallowed by fire. But the final moments of safety inside the Ortega home were so full of joy, so deeply rooted in family identity, that no one inside could have possibly imagined the horror about to arrive. It was December 24th, 2008, and for the Ortega family, Christmas Eve was the highlight of their year. Not because of the gifts or the food or the decorations, though they always did those well. It was the togetherness, the ritual of reunion, a kind of inherited tradition families passed down like heirlooms. By early evening, relatives began pouring in from nearby cities. Some brought tins of homemade cookies. Others brought wrapped gifts. Others brought their children dressed in festive pajamas. Every arrival came with the same scene. Coats removed, kisses exchanged, and someone shouting, "Come inside, you're just in time." Inside, the house felt almost alive. Walls covered with family photos, tile floors slightly warm from all the cooking, the smell of cinnamon and masa floating through the air. The Christmas tree lights reflected off the ornaments, casting tiny sparkles across the living room walls. Grandparents sat in their favorite chairs, sharing stories from decades earlier. Stories the children had heard many times, but still begged to hear again. The kind of stories that anchor a family, reminding them where they came from, what they survived, what they built. By 8 p.m., the kitchen was loud, a symphony of sizzling pans, clinking plates, and overlapping conversations. Cousins who hadn't seen each other all year leaned over the counter, trading stories over cups of hot chocolate. Older relatives formed small circles, talking about work, children, health, and how quickly the year had passed. Children ran through the hallways, chasing each other with so much energy. The adults joked they must have eaten sugar in secret. One child showed off a new pair of pajamas. Another carried a toy car he refused to let go of. A third kept asking if Santa was already on his way. Nobody noticed the time. Nobody needed to. Because gatherings like this don't run on clocks. They run on connection. Even the little stressful moments felt warm. Someone burned a batch of cookies, and everyone laughed. Someone spilled punch on the carpet, and another aunt rushed in with towels, scolding and smiling at the same time. Someone tried to fix the karaoke machine for the 10th time, determined to make it work so the night could end with off-key Christmas songs. By 10 p.m., the house was in full celebration. Every generation represented, every corner filled with voices, every plate full. But every perfect moment carries a shadow, the shadow of unpredictability, the shadow of what we can't imagine. Just outside this glowing home, a man sat in his car, breathing slowly inside a thick, padded Santa suit. His thoughts were not joyful. They were focused, cold, measured. He checked the weapons under his sleeve. 4 9mm handguns, each loaded, each ready. Then he looked at the large wrapped box beside him. A handmade flamethrower, hours of engineering, months of planning, and a terrifying amount of high-octane racing fuel. He lifted it with both hands, feeling its weight. The weight of destruction. There was nothing spontaneous about what he was about to do. Nothing emotional. Nothing uncontrolled. He stepped out of the car. The street was quiet. A calm December night. Cold air drifting over trimmed lawns and glowing Christmas lights. He walked toward the Ortega home, his boots crunching softly against the pavement. He approached the driveway, filled with cars belonging to relatives who had no idea they were being watched. He adjusted his beard, straightened his jacket, and checked the flamethrower one last time. Then he reached the porch. He stood at the door he once entered as a guest, a door he now approached as a destroyer. Inside, the Ortega family had begun a gift exchange. Children squealed when their names were called. Present, as someone opened a sweater or a candle or a silly novelty item. Someone joked that Uncle James always bought the weirdest gifts, and everyone laughed. For a moment, the house was suspended in pure joy. Then the doorbell rang. It sounded innocently, just a soft chime floating through the noise of the party. The little girl, the same one who had been practicing her Christmas song earlier, ran toward the door. She was excited, hopeful, curious. When she peeked through the glass, she saw a tall figure in a Santa suit, holding a giant present. She gasped. She smiled. She turned the doorknob. The man didn't hesitate. He raised his gun and fired into her face. She fell backward, and screams erupted. What happened next was a kind of chaos most people can't comprehend, not because they lack imagination, but because the human mind is not built to process violence in sacred places. Adults dove behind furniture. Some grabbed children and shielded them. Some froze where they stood, unable to process the transformation of their home into a war zone. But one of the most devastating truths of that night was how recognizable the gunman was. Even dressed as Santa, the Ortega family knew the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the way he moved. This was Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, the ex-husband of Sylvia Ortega, a man who had once sat at the table with them, eaten meals with them, shared conversations with them. A man whose divorce had been finalized 6 days earlier. A man who felt entitled to their sympathy, their approval, and ultimately, their destruction. He stepped further inside the home. Still firing. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't look like someone capable of walking into a home full of children and grandparents and turning it into a war zone. He looked ordinary, quiet, sometimes stiff, a little awkward, but normal. That was part of the illusion. To understand how a man becomes the kind of monster who dresses as Santa Claus to carry out an execution, we have to go back to the beginning of Bruce Jeffrey Pardo, back to the pieces of his personality that were always there, even if no one recognized them as warning signs. Because killers like Bruce don't emerge out of nowhere. They form slowly, layer by layer, hidden beneath politeness, job titles, and the shallow stability of adulthood. And sometimes, the people around them don't realize how fragile they are until the mask slips completely. Bruce was born in 1963 in Southern California, a time of economic growth, suburban expansion, optimism, and the rise of stable middle-class careers. His family was average, not wealthy, not poor. Not chaotic, not perfect. Just ordinary. Bruce stood out academically. Teachers described him as bright, analytical, good with numbers. He didn't make trouble. He didn't draw attention. He fit into a mold easily. But what people remembered most, even back then, was his emotional distance. He wasn't unkind, just unreachable. He didn't share much about himself. He didn't laugh loudly. He didn't cry. He simply blended into the background, present but not connected. As he grew older, the traits sharpened. He followed rules strictly. He avoided confrontation. He internalized stress. And he built his identity around one core belief: control equals safety. He went on to college to study engineering, a field that rewarded precision, predictability, logic, and structure. The perfect environment for someone who wanted life to behave according to formulas. By his late 20s and early 30s, Bruce had secured a stable job as an aerospace engineer. High salary, good benefits, the image of success. But behind that steady exterior, the cracks were already forming. Co-workers described him as polite but cold. A man who participated in office events only on the surface. Someone who avoided vulnerable conversations and hated being challenged, even about small things. He wasn't the type to explode outwardly. He was the type to implode internally. Still, no one saw danger. Not yet. The first real warning sign came quietly, the kind of detail that gets buried in a future biography, but that forensic psychologists later point to. And that's where you can see who he truly was. Bruce had a son, a little boy, born from a relationship he didn't maintain, but acknowledged enough to share responsibility. For a short time. One afternoon, while Bruce was supposed to be supervising the child, the boy fell into a swimming pool and nearly drowned. He survived, but with severe, permanent brain damage. A tragedy that should have changed Bruce forever. A tragedy that demanded maturity, accountability, and emotional presence. But instead of stepping up, he stepped away. Instead of supporting the boy's long-term medical needs, he distanced himself. Instead of taking responsibility for his role in the accident, he detached emotionally and financially. He walked out of the child's life completely. He pretended the boy didn't exist, erased him, buried the memory beneath layers of denial and justification. And in that single decision, we see the blueprint of the man he truly was. When reality became too uncomfortable, he abandoned it. When responsibility demanded sacrifice, he withdrew. When consequences confronted him, he rewrote the narrative. This pattern, avoidance, denial, abandonment, would later become the psychological backbone of the Covina Massacre. But at the time, people simply saw a man who moved on. Years passed. Bruce continued his career. He continued presenting himself as stable, successful, respectable. On paper, he was everything a partner might want. And then he met Sylvia Ortega. Warm, kind, family-oriented, full of life, deeply connected to her siblings, parents, children, and extended family. Where Bruce was controlled, Sylvia was expressive. Where Bruce was rigid, Sylvia was flexible. Where Bruce isolated, Sylvia connected. Opposites can attract, but sometimes opposites only expose what one partner is incapable of giving. Their relationship moved quickly. By 2006, they were married. A ceremony surrounded by Sylvia's large, loving family. And for a brief moment, Bruce seemed committed. But Sylvia soon learned a truth that others had missed. Bruce didn't want a partnership. He wanted a stage. He didn't want to build a life together. He wanted a life that showcased him, his success, his image, his version of reality. He refused to support Sylvia's children from her previous marriage. He controlled spending to an extreme. He hid assets. He lied about his financial obligations. And he kept the existence of his disabled son a secret. Every conflict in the marriage brought out the same response. Bruce withdrawing, stonewalling, or blaming others, never himself. Eventually, the distance became unbearable. Sylvia filed for divorce. And that was the beginning of his psychological collapse. Divorce didn't just hurt Bruce. It humiliated him. It stripped him of control. It forced him into the role of the problem, a role he could not tolerate. During the divorce proceedings, he was ordered to pay spousal support. The court favored Sylvia. His finances were scrutinized. His lies were exposed. He lost his job. His sense of superiority fractured. Each ruling chipped away at the self-image he had spent decades constructing. To most people, divorce is a painful chapter. To Bruce, it was an existential threat. He felt attacked, cornered, publicly diminished. His fragile identity, built on control, perfection, and facade, began to crumble. Friends, later, described him as not himself. Quiet, withdrawn, brooding, carrying resentment like a weight on his shoulders. But what they didn't see was the transformation happening privately. His frustration was turning into fixation. His bitterness was turning into ideology. And his ideology was turning into a plan. The more powerless he felt, the more he fantasized about reclaiming that power. And eventually, his fantasies turned violent. But violence wasn't his first language. Control was. So he didn't lash out impulsively. He didn't confront Sylvia angrily. He didn't scream or make threats. He did something far more dangerous. He began planning quietly, patiently, systematically. For months, he researched weapons. He practiced shooting. He legally purchased 4 9mm handguns, rotating the buys so he wouldn't draw suspicion. He designed and built a homemade flamethrower, an engineer creating a device of destruction. He commissioned a custom Santa suit, oversized, tailored to conceal weapons, and meant to disarm victims emotionally. He mapped escape routes. He withdrew tens of thousands of dollars. He purchased a plane ticket to Canada. He studied the Ortega family's patterns, their traditions, their Christmas Eve schedule. He knew exactly when they would gather, exactly how many would be inside, exactly how vulnerable they would be. This wasn't a break. This wasn't insanity. This was premeditation, the kind seen only in the darkest family annihilation cases. Bruce wasn't preparing for a confrontation. He wasn't preparing for a message. He wasn't preparing for negotiation. He was preparing for annihilation. In his mind, he wasn't just killing people. He was reclaiming the narrative / rewriting his story, punishing those he blamed for his downfall. He believed Sylvia's family had humiliated him. He believed they had sided with her unfairly. He believed they had poisoned his reputation. He believed they had stripped him of the life he deserved. And in that warped psychological reality, he saw the massacre not as murder, but as justice. The man who walked toward the Ortega home in a Santa suit was not simply angry. He was resolved. He was mission-driven. He had abandoned empathy long before he arrived at the doorstep. He was a man who had been building toward destruction, piece by piece, decision by decision, lie by lie, until there was nothing left inside him but the belief that the only way to restore his sense of power was to destroy an entire family. And that is exactly what he set out to do on Christmas Eve. There is a moment in the unraveling of certain individuals, a moment that is almost invisible to the outside world, when anger stops feeling like an emotion and begins transforming into a mission. For Bruce Pardo, that moment came quietly. Not during a court hearing, not during an argument, not during a conversation with Sylvia. It came alone, in silence, in isolation, as he sat inside the shell of the life he had built and watched it collapse around him. From the outside, Bruce appeared calm during the divorce. He wasn't the stereotypical angry ex-husband yelling in courtrooms or harassing his partner. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't visibly vindictive. He wasn't dramatic. He was quiet, too quiet. And that silence hid something far more dangerous than rage. A psychological shift from feeling wronged to feeling justified. Divorce was not just painful for Bruce. It was humiliating. It stripped him of something he needed more than love, the illusion of control. He had built his entire adult identity around being the stable one, the successful one, the one who had everything figured out, the one who made decisions, not suffered consequences. But suddenly, he was being forced to do what he hated most, face himself. When the court ordered him to pay Sylvia $10,000 in support, Bruce felt attacked. When the judge criticized his financial behavior, he felt exposed. When Sylvia's family supported her publicly, he felt judged. Every ruling, every legal document, every uncomfortable truth uncovered during the divorce became, in his mind, an assault on his identity. Some men lose marriages. Bruce felt he was losing himself. And when a man whose ego is held together by control begins to feel powerless, his mind looks for something, anything, to blame. He didn't blame his lies. He didn't blame his abandonment of responsibilities. He didn't blame the emotional distance he created. He blamed Sylvia. He blamed the Ortegas. He blamed the court. He blamed his job. He blamed the world. This is where the descent began. He stopped viewing the divorce as a personal failure and started viewing it as a conspiracy against him. This shift is something forensic psychologists call externalization of blame, a hallmark trait of individuals who commit family annihilation. It's not anger that leads them to violence. It's the refusal to accept responsibility. And as Bruce rewrote the story of his life in his own mind, he cast himself as the victim, the innocent one, the betrayed one, the unfairly punished one. The Ortega family, who had welcomed him, fed him, accepted him, became, in his fractured psychology, the symbol of everything he believed he had lost: his marriage, his dignity, his money, his future. And once he framed them as the source of his suffering, it became possible for him to justify the unthinkable. It did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, in thoughts he never shared aloud. Thoughts like, "They ruined my life. They humiliated me. They took everything. They deserve consequences. They deserve to feel my pain." These thoughts didn't explode. They simmered. And simmering rage is far more dangerous than rage that erupts. Over the course of several months, Bruce's inner world darkened. He withdrew from friends. He stopped attending social gatherings. He began spending long hours alone. He avoided coworkers. He ignored invitations. When a frustrated individual begins imagining scenarios that restore their power. He imagined confronting Sylvia. He imagined confronting her family. He imagined telling them what they had done to him. But fantasies of confrontation evolved. They became fantasies of retaliation, of making them understand his suffering, of forcing them to feel helpless, of flipping the power dynamic. These fantasies were not fleeting. They became routine, a mental ritual that provided relief from the sense of inadequacy he refused to acknowledge. And potentially, the fantasies shifted again, from general revenge to specific acts, specific plans, specific outcomes. This is the moment where psychological dissent becomes dangerous, when a fantasy stops being imagination and becomes preparation. Bruce began imagining the Ortegas gathered together, like they always did on Christmas Eve, laughing, celebrating, ignoring him, moving on with their lives. The idea was unbearable to him. The thought that life continued without him, that Sylvia was happy again, that her family was still whole, that they were smiling on the holiday he spent alone. It broke something inside him. Most people process heartbreak through grief. Bruce processed it through vengeance. What began as sadness turned into resentment. Resentment turned into fixation. Fixation turned into planning. And once the planning began, there was no turning back. The first step was small. A thought, a question, a possibility. What if I confront them all at once? Then, what if I make sure they never forget me? Then, what if I make them pay? Once the mind crosses that line, the descent accelerates. Bruce started researching weapons. Slowly, at first. Curiously. Almost academically. Then, more intensely. With purpose. With intent. He made trips to gun stores. Visited shooting ranges. Asked technical questions about ammunition. Practiced regularly. Building familiarity with his 9mm pistols. But guns weren't enough. Guns kill, but fire destroys. And destruction was what Bruce wanted. Total annihilation. A permanent erasure. So he built a flamethrower. Piece by piece. Part by part. Pipe fittings. Pressure tanks. A spraying mechanism. Racing fuel purchased under the radar. A remote ignition system. In his garage, this man, this quiet, polite engineer, constructed a machine designed to burn a home from the inside out. It was methodical, calculated, emotionally detached. Not the work of a man in the midst of madness, but the work of a man who had embraced purpose. While building the device, he rarely spoke to neighbors. He avoided eye contact. He spent more time in his garage than in his living room. But if anyone saw him, he smiled, he waved, he looked normal. He had become two people. The man the world recognized, polite, quiet, calm, and the man he had become, a person who believed destruction was justice. Next came the Santa suit. He didn't buy a cheap costume. He commissioned a custom one. Oversized, padded, with reinforced interior sections to conceal multiple weapons, thick enough to hide movement, large enough to store ammunition, and symbolically perfect, a costume associated with joy, innocence, and family. It wasn't just camouflage. It was irony, cruel, calculated irony. Every step in Bruce's descent was deliberate. Every choice served a purpose. Every action fed the fantasy he had been nurturing for months. By the time December arrived, he was no longer imagining revenge. He was preparing for it. His home became a staging area. Guns cleaned and loaded. Fuel mixed and sealed. Santa suit pressed and ready, a plane ticket to Canada purchased, cash withdrawn, vehicles rented and positioned, maps printed, routes planned, contingencies prepared. This was not the behavior of a man who snapped. This was the behavior of a man who saw violence as restoration, correction, balance. A man who believed that the only way to reclaim his sense of identity was to take away the identity of others. As Christmas Eve approached, Bruce's life was quiet, eerily quiet. He seemed calmer than before. Family annihilators often experience this calm right before their attack. Psychologists call it the resolution phase, the moment when a killer stops struggling internally because they've committed to their plan. Once the decision is made and the fantasy becomes a mission, their anxiety dissolves, their doubts disappear, their emotions flatten. They feel at peace, not because they are healed, but because they are resolved. Bruce spent December 23rd finalizing his preparations. On December 24th, he dressed in his custom-made Santa suit. He loaded the weapons into his car. He placed the flamethrower, disguised as a gift, onto the seat beside him. And for a moment, as he looked at himself in the rearview mirror, he saw exactly who he wanted to be. Not a failure, not a rejected husband, not a man who lost control, but a man with a mission, a man reclaiming power, a man who, in his delusion, believed he was delivering justice. With every mile he drove toward the Ortega home, his breathing steadied, his heartbeat slowed, his mind quieted. The descent was complete. The man he used to be was gone, and the man who stepped out of that car in a Santa suit was someone capable of walking into a home full of people he once called family, and bringing hell with him. Christmas Eve is supposed to be a night of safety, a night where fear and danger retreat from the world, replaced by family, warmth, and the quiet hope that tomorrow will bring something better. Inside the Ortega family home, that hope was alive. The smell of food still lingered in the air. Wrapping paper was scattered across the floor. Children giggled through half-opened gifts. Adults leaned back on couches, comfortably full, savoring the final hours of Christmas Eve. Laughter drifted through the rooms. Soft music played in the background. Someone joked about needing a second round of dessert. Someone else teased their cousin about singing off-key during karaoke. It was the kind of night where the world feels small and safe, where danger feels impossible. And then the doorbell rang. A sound so ordinary, so harmless, that nobody in the house imagined it would mark the end of everything they knew. The 8-year-old girl who ran to the door had no reason to be afraid. She had only ever associated Santa Claus with gifts, surprises, and stories told at bedtime. When she peeked through the glass and saw the red suit, she didn't hesitate. She didn't call for help. She didn't question why Santa was ringing the doorbell instead of coming down the chimney. She simply opened the door, because that's what a child does when magic arrives at her doorstep. Bruce Pardo raised his gun. A blast erupted. The bullet struck her in the face. She collapsed onto the floor. The first scream sliced through the house. Adults turned toward the entryway, some rushing forward, others instinctively grabbing children. But Bruce had already stepped inside. His Santa boots crossed the threshold. He moved with cold precision, eyes scanning the room. Guns already drawn. Mission engaged. He began firing. Chaos exploded instantly. The Ortega family scattered, some diving behind couches, others running toward the kitchen, others dropping to the ground in shock and confusion. But confusion didn't last long. They recognized him, even beneath the Santa suit, the jawline, the posture, the gait. This was Sylvia's ex-husband. This was the quiet man who used to sit at their table, share meals with them, laugh politely at their jokes. But the man standing before them was unrecognizable, a figure consumed not by love or loss, but by an engineered mission of extermination. He fired toward the center of the living room, where the family had gathered moments earlier. The sound of gunshots echoed through the hallways, shattering picture frames, puncturing walls, replacing the warmth of Christmas Eve with panic. Sylvia tried to flee. Bruce shot her almost immediately. The woman he once vowed to love became the first adult victim of his rampage. Her parents, Alicia and Joseph Ortega, were shot next. Elderly, slow-moving, confused by the chaos. They didn't have time to react. The heart of the family was being torn apart in seconds. Uncles and cousins tried to shield children. Some attempted to rush Bruce. Others screamed for their loved ones. The sound inside the house was a mixture of gunfire, terror, and incomprehensible disbelief. A few family members managed to escape through side doors or jump from second-floor windows, landing injured but alive. Those who survived later described the same horrifying realization. The man in the Santa suit wasn't here to scare them. He wasn't here to threaten them. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to kill. Bruce moved through the home with mechanical calm. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He moved like a man following a blueprint. Step, aim, fire. Step, aim, fire. Psychologists would later point to this behavior as a sign of mission-oriented annihilation, a subtype of mass murder where the killer sees his actions as a form of cleansing or retribution. But inside the house, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was survival. Children hid behind chairs. Aunt Alicia shielded a younger cousin with her body. Uncle James tried to crawl toward the front door to pull the injured 8-year-old to safety. The living room, once full of wrapping paper and half-opened gifts, was now a place of terror. And just when the gunfire slowed, when a flicker of hope might have formed in someone's mind, Bruce took the next step in his plan. He set down the wrapped box he had carried into the house. The box that looked like a giant Christmas gift. The box that concealed his custom-built flamethrower and gallons of high-octane racing fuel. Survivors later said they saw him kneel toward it. Some thought he was reloading. Some thought he was searching for another gun. Then the smell began. Sharp, chemical, choking. A smell that didn't belong anywhere near a Christmas tree. Racing fuel. He opened the device and began unleashing a torrent of flammable liquid across the living room, soaking furniture, carpets, walls, and victims already injured or unable to move. Someone shouted, "Run." Someone else screamed, "Get out." But there was no out, no safe direction, no door that wasn't blocked by flames, bullets, or debris. The fuel spread rapidly, coating everything it touched. It pooled under furniture. It soaked into the carpet. It splashed across stockings hanging over the fireplace. And then, with one movement, one flick, one decision that sealed the fate of the entire night, he ignited it. The explosion wasn't small. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't predictable. The racing fuel turned the home into an inferno instantaneously. Flames roared upward, consuming dry wood, furniture, curtains, and anything that could burn. Heat surged through the house so fast that windows shattered outward, blasting hot air into the cold night. People outside blocks away later said the explosion sounded like a bomb detonating. Inside, survivors described the fire as a wave, a wall, a monster that swallowed the room whole. The temperature shot above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal, to fuse bone, to collapse the ceiling. One of the most heartbreaking truths about the Covina Christmas Massacre is that many victims died not from gunshots, but from the fire. Some were already injured and couldn't escape. Some were disoriented by smoke and heat. Some tried to pull others out and became trapped themselves. In the chaos, someone broke a window with their bare hands. Someone else pushed children outward through a shattered frame. A cousin later said she jumped from the second floor and didn't even feel the pain until days later. The house that had been full of life became a furnace. Burning memories, burning photographs, burning gifts, burning everything the Ortega family had built across generations. It took firefighters more than an hour just to get close enough to the house to begin containment. The fire was so intense that they couldn't enter. For a long time, what they found inside was devastating. 9 lives ended. 3 generations gone. The Ortega home, once a beacon of love and unity, was reduced to ash, charred beams, and melted remnants that barely resembled a house at all. Outside, neighbors stood in horror, some crying, some unable to process what they had heard, all asking the same question: who would do this? But only the survivors knew immediately. They had seen the face under the beard. They had recognized the eyes. They had lived through the moment the monster revealed himself. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't random. This wasn't meaningless violence. This was Bruce Pardo, a man they once welcomed into their family, returning to destroy them on the night meant for peace. For 9 minutes, Bruce Pardo believed he was in control. Every step he took inside the Ortega home was rehearsed. Every bullet fired was part of a plan. Every movement, from the knock at the door to the final ignition of the flamethrower, was the execution of a script he had written long before Christmas Eve. But control is an illusion. And in the end, the most important element of his meticulously crafted plan was the one that turned against him: fire. Bruce believed fire would erase everything: the home, the evidence, the family's legacy, and his own responsibility. But fire doesn't negotiate. Fire doesn't obey engineering equations. Fire doesn't execute plans. It consumes, and it consumed him too. When Bruce ignited the racing fuel mixture, the explosion that followed was far more intense than he anticipated. It wasn't a small burst. It wasn't a contained. It was a violent, uncontrolled detonation. The room erupted into flames with such force that it created a sudden pressure wave, a blast of heat so powerful that parts of his Santa suit melted, not away from him, onto him. Synthetic fibers fused to his skin. The red suit, once symbolic, became a cage of burning plastic and fabric bonded to his body. He tried to shield himself, but his gloves melted too. He attempted to step back, but flames ignited the fuel coating the floor, licking upward around him. The man who believed he had engineered the perfect crime was now on fire. The burns were catastrophic. Later medical analysis estimated he suffered deep second-degree burns, severe third-degree burns, melting of synthetic fabric into his flesh, skin sloughing from his arms and legs, facial burns beneath the beard. damage to his hands that affected his ability to grasp or move. He could still walk, barely, but with every step, his body screamed with pain. Cloves stuck to his wounds. Smoke filled his lungs. Blood dripped through the seams of the Santa suit. This was not the escape he had planned. Still, in the chaos of fire and collapse, Bruce managed to stumble back to his car parked outside. Neighbors later recalled seeing a man in a burning Santa suit staggering through the smoke, an image so bizarre and horrifying that their minds couldn't process what they were witnessing. But Bruce didn't stop to speak to anyone. He didn't hesitate. He didn't panic. He got into his rental car, turned the key, and drove away, leaving behind a home engulfed in flames and a street filled with screams. But inside the car, the illusion of control was gone. His steering was shaky. His breathing was labored. Every movement tore at the burned, melting fabric fused to his skin. Every second was agony. Bruce had planned everything except this. He thought he would leave the scene untouched. He thought he would walk away without injury. He thought he would disappear into another country. But the fire had rewritten the script. Instead of a clean getaway, Bruce was a man falling apart. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, he drove to one of the vehicles he had prepared for his escape, hiding in another neighborhood. But once he reached it, he realized something horrifying. He wasn't just burned. He was dying. His wounds were severe enough that he would not survive a full escape route without medical attention. Yet, he could not seek medical care. He could not walk into a hospital. He could not explain the burns. He could not risk being identified. He had boxed himself into a corner, and the fire had sealed the exit. Bruce then drove to his brother's home in Sylmar, but his brother Greg wasn't home. Bruce let himself in with a key he still possessed. He walked into the quiet living room. The holiday lights from across the neighborhood glowed through the window. Outside, people were asleep, dreaming of Christmas morning. Inside the house, blood dripped from Bruce's burns onto the carpet. His hands were barely functional. His face had blistered and split under the melted beard. He sat heavily in a chair, breathing in short, pained gasps. This moment, this stillness, is perhaps the closest we get to understanding his final psychology. Because after months of planning, after constructing weapons, after rehearsing the massacre, after convincing himself that destruction would restore his sense of power, in the end, he was alone, burned, bleeding, humiliated, and no longer in control. Some criminologists believe this is when Bruce first realized the true magnitude of what he had done. Not morally, but strategically. His plan was collapsing. He couldn't escape by plane. He could not cross borders with such severe burns. He could not run. He could barely move without tearing flesh. The man who once believed he was untouchable was now trapped inside his failing body. He reached for one of his remaining guns, a 9mm pistol, the same type he had used inside the Ortega home. And with that weapon, in his brother's living room, Bruce ended his life with a single shot. When police arrived the next morning to conduct a welfare check on Greg, he was dressed partially in the burned remains of his Santa suit. Melted patches were fused to his skin. Blood had dried in dark patterns across the carpet. His burns were so severe that parts of the fabric had to be surgically removed during the autopsy. But what investigators found next is what stunned the nation. Taped to his leg, with the precision of someone who had engineered every detail, was $17,000 in cash. next to his body, was a plane ticket to Canada, scheduled for December 25th. His car contained maps, food supplies, clothes, ammunition, a second custom Santa suit, rented vehicles prepared for transfer, fuel materials, and surveillance notes. Bruce's plan had been simple in theory. Massacre the family, burn the evidence, change cars, drive north, and flee the country. But fire, the weapon he believed would erase the Ortega family, instead erased his escape route. It is a moment that criminologists call poetic contradiction, when a killer's own plan becomes their downfall. In the aftermath, investigators pieced together his movements. They interviewed neighbors who had seen him practicing with weapons. They tracked his purchases of fuel and equipment. They analyzed his divorce file and found patterns of resentment and fixation. From Presti, investigators pieced together. They mapped out his rental vehicles and traced the route he intended to take to Canada. He intended to restart his life under a new identity. He intended to live, turn back on him, destroying the path he believed would save him. In the end, the man who tried to erase an entire family was undone by the very weapon he created. A final irony in a story filled with cruelty and contradiction. And so, the Covina Christmas Massacre ended not with a manhunt, not with a standoff, not with a dramatic arrest, but with a killer sitting alone in a quiet house, surrounded by shadows of Christmas lights, bleeding out beneath the burned remains of a Santa Claus costume. His life ended in the same way it had been lived, not with an explosion, not with an empty house, but with a quiet collapse. The massacre was over, but the aftermath, for the Ortega family, for law enforcement, for every community, and for every person touched by this tragedy, was only beginning. When the flames finally began to recede, and when firefighters were able to approach the Ortega home safely, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Hours earlier, it had been a quiet suburban street, decorated with Christmas lights and inflatable reindeer. Now, it looked like a disaster zone. A street filled with emergency vehicles, hoses snaking across driveways, paramedics rushing to ambulances, neighbors standing outside in shock, faces illuminated by the orange glow of the fire that refused to die. The fire that Bruce Pardo had ignited was unlike anything the Covina Fire Department had faced in a residential home. This was not a kitchen fire. This was not an electrical malfunction. This was a deliberate inferno, powered by racing fuel, a substance designed for speed, volatility, and explosive combustion. It burned hotter than typical house fires, faster than normal ignition patterns, and in ways that turned the home into a kind of furnace. Firefighters spent hours battling the blaze, not because they lacked skill, but because the fire had been engineered to be unstoppable. Even with their best efforts, they couldn't save the structure. By the time the flames were fully extinguished, the Ortega home had collapsed inward. Roof charred, beams twisted, black smoke rising into the cold December air. What remained was a skeletal frame, recognizable only by its outline, completely unrecognizable as the home it once was. For the survivors who escaped, the sight of the house, reduced to ash, was almost as traumatic as the attack itself. Some had jumped from second-story windows. Some had crawled through broken glass. Some had run barefoot across burning debris. Some had carried children through smoke so thick they could barely breathe. The first survivor statements were fragmented, covered in soot, voices shaking, eyes wide with shock. They repeated the same words: Santa, Santa. He was dressed like Santa. Law enforcement officers, arriving on the scene, initially struggled to comprehend what they were hearing. Santa? A shooting? A firebombing? It sounded like a hallucination, a nightmare, a story impossible to process. But then, the details began aligning. The melted remains of a Santa suit were found outside the home. A flamethrower design was discovered in the debris. Shell casings scattered the entranceway. The door had bullet holes. Blood marked the floor. And the survivors all pointed to the same man, Bruce Jeffrey Pardo. Detectives immediately connected the massacre to his divorce from Sylvia. It took minutes, not hours, to establish motive. But the magnitude of the attack took much longer to understand. Inside the ruins of the home, firefighters found bodies, some in clusters, some near windows, some near doorways where they had attempted to escape. 9 people had died. 3 generations of the Ortega family. In any mass casualty incident, there is a silent, brutal step in the aftermath. The point where investigators must examine what remains. But in this case, the fire was so intense that traditional identification methods were nearly impossible. Dental records had to be used. Fragments had to be matched. The process was slow, technical, painstaking. The Ortega family's grief began long before official notifications were made. But when the confirmations came, the reality became crushing. 9 names, 9 losses, a mother, a father, sons, daughters, sisters, a brother-in-law, a grandmother. An entire stretch of a family tree severed in a single night. For survivors, Christmas would never again mean joy. It would never again symbolize warmth. The holiday became a permanent scar, a reminder of the night everything changed. In the days that followed, the national media descended upon Covina. News vans lined the streets. Reporters delivered broadcasts with heavy voices, trying to explain something that made no sense. A man dressed as Santa Claus, a symbol of innocence, had committed one of the most violent family massacres in the country's history. The story spread instantly across the nation, not just because of the brutality, but because of the symbolism. Christmas Eve, Santa suit, family home, flamethrower. These elements combined into a tragedy so surreal that people struggled to accept it as real. Psychologists were interviewed in news segments. They discussed narcissistic personality traits, revenge motives, and the psychological collapse that precedes mass killings. One forensic psychologist said, "He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to annihilate. He wanted to erase the existence of this family." Another explained the Santa suit. It was symbolic. It was mockery. It was a disguise specifically chosen because it represented trust. Law enforcement officials held press conferences. They revealed details of the massacre, the weapons used, and the way the fire spread unnaturally fast due to racing fuel. They disclosed the evidence found on Bruce's body: the cash, the plane ticket, the burns. They showed maps of his failed escape route. They described how the fire had toned against him. The irony became a recurring theme in public commentary. The killer who wanted to erase others was undone by the weapon he created. But for the Ortega family, none of the analysis mattered. Their grief was raw. Their lives were changed forever. Funeral arrangements had to be made. 9 coffins, 9 eulogies, 9 memorials. The community came together in overwhelming numbers. So many people attended the vigils that the city had to block off streets. Candles were placed along the sidewalks. Flowers covered the fences. Photos of the victims fluttered in the wind. Neighbors left handwritten notes describing the family's kindness, their generosity, their presence in the community. The surviving children were comforted by family members who were also grieving. Some were too young to understand the full scale of the loss. Others understood all too well. The little girl who opened the door survived, physically, but the emotional wound would last a lifetime. Her innocence had been shattered by the sight of a man wearing the world's most beloved costume, a costume she would never again see with trust. In the weeks after the massacre, investigators reconstructed the timeline in detail. They pieced together every movement Bruce made in the months leading up to the attack. Every purchase, every practice session, every disguise, every rented vehicle. They drew a portrait of a man who had become obsessed with revenge, obsessed with control, obsessed with the idea that destroying a family would somehow heal the wounds he refused to take responsibility for. But the more they uncovered, the more chilling the portrait became. He had planned not only to kill the Ortega family, but to vanish afterward, to disappear into a new identity, leaving the ashes of the tragedy behind him. He intended to live. He intended to escape. He intended to move on. This wasn't a suicide mission. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. This was a murderous blueprint carried out with engineering-level precision and emotional-level cruelty. Yet, despite his planning, despite his calculations, despite his attempt to play the role of both executioner and survivor, Bruce failed. His own plan consumed him. The fire that he set became the fire that ended him. And so, as the community mourned, as investigators analyzed, as the media dissected, there remained one haunting truth. The people who died that night were not part of a mystery. They were part of a tragedy. A tragedy triggered by one man's refusal to accept that life didn't go his way. The Ortegas were remembered not for the violence that took them, but for the love they shared in life. Their home had been filled with warmth. Their traditions were rich. Their connections were deep. Their presence in the community was strong. And that legacy, unlike their home, could not be burned. Over time, the community rebuilt. Not physically, the house remained an empty lot for years, but emotionally. People checked on one another more often. They volunteered. They supported the surviving children. They made meals, donated funds, shared memories. They refused to let the tragedy be the final chapter. But the shadow of that night never disappeared entirely. It lived in the memories of those who were there, in the scars on the survivors' bodies, in the quiet of Christmas Eve, when the world pauses and the heart remembers. Because the cost of hate is never limited to the moment it explodes. It ripples outward, through families, through communities, through the very fabric of society. The aftermath of the Covina Christmas Massacre was not just sorrow. It was a reminder of what can happen when resentment goes unchecked, when accountability is avoided, and when one man's anger becomes everyone's tragedy. And in this aftermath, in the ruins of the home, the grief of the community, the analysis of investigators, one final question rose. How does a man become this? And what can we learn from the ashes he left behind? These questions lead us into the heart of Section 7, a final reflection that blends psychology, memory, and legacy. The fire eventually died. The investigation eventually ended. The media eventually moved on. But for the survivors of the Ortega family and for the community of Covina, The story never truly ended, because tragedies of this magnitude do not disappear with the final flames. They linger in memories, in scars, in rituals forever changed, in the silence that settles when a name is spoken, and there is no voice left to answer. In the wake of the massacre, a question echoed through the country. How could this happen? But a deeper question echoed in the hearts of those who knew the Ortega family. Why them? Why this family? Why this night? It would be easy to say it happened because one man was evil. But the truth is more complicated and more human. It happened because one man refused to face his failures. Because one man viewed accountability as humiliation. Because one man mistook consequences for betrayal. Because one man's broken ego became a weapon aimed at the people who reflected his flaws back at him. And that man walked into the Ortega family's life long before he walked into their home with a flamethrower. To understand the legacy of this tragedy, you have to understand who the Ortegas were. They were a family built on tradition, a kind of tradition that doesn't come from money or prestige, but from togetherness. Alicia and Joseph Ortega were the anchors, the pillars. They created a home where everyone felt welcome, where food was a love language, where laughter was the soundtrack, where generosity was a value passed down through every generation. Their adult children carried those values into their own families. They lived near each other, celebrated together, supported each other. When someone was sick, they made food, but because he did not know how to be part of something larger than himself. When his marriage began to collapse, he didn't turn to the family for support. He didn't seek connection. He didn't seek forgiveness. He saw their unity as judgment. He saw their closeness as alliance. He saw their love for Sylvia as betrayal. It is difficult to comprehend that a man can take something as beautiful as a family's traditions and turn them into justification for violence. But that is exactly what happened. Bruce convinced himself that the Ortegas were his enemy, that their love for Sylvia, their support during the divorce, their presence in each other's lives was an attack on him. He mistook their strength for opposition. He mistook their unity for exclusion. He mistook their family for a threat. This is the tragedy beneath the tragedy. A man who could have chosen accountability chose annihilation instead. As investigators pieced together Bruce's final months, they found journals filled with grievances, financial spreadsheets proving he had lied, purchases that suggested preparation long before the divorce was final. They found an emotional pattern common among family annihilators, a fragile sense of self, a fear of failure, a belief that others are responsible for personal shortcomings, a fantasy of restoring control through destruction. Psychologists later described Bruce as a man with narcissistic traits, avoidant tendencies, emotional detachment, a long history of abandonment and denial, a deep fear of humiliation, and an inability to process shame. When such a personality is confronted with consequences, the internal collapse can turn dangerous. But even this explanation feels insufficient when measured against the magnitude of the loss. 9 people are gone: a mother, a father, 3 daughters, 1 son, a daughter-in-law, a grandmother. Their absence left a void that could never be filled. And yet, in the aftermath, the community witnessed something extraordinary. They witnessed resilience. The surviving members of the Ortega family came together with the same unity that defined their lives before the tragedy. They supported one another. They grieved openly. They shared stories. They held memorials that honored not their deaths, but their lives. The little girl who opened the door, who survived the first bullet, became a symbol of strength. Her survival carried a weight beyond her years, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, life can continue. Neighbors held vigils. Churches opened their doors. Donations poured in from strangers across the nation. Letters arrived from people who had never met the Ortegas, but felt compelled to share their condolences, their prayers, their heartbreak. In these gestures, you can see how tragedies ripple outward, not just in grief, but in compassion. The Ortega family was more than the victims of a massacre. They were people who lived with purpose, who loved fiercely, who built a legacy that even fire could not destroy. Their names continue to be spoken, not in whispers of fear, but in echoes of love. And this leads to the final question that lingers in documentaries like this. The question viewers feel in their chest long after the credits roll. Why? Why did this have to happen? What turns a man into a monster? There is no single answer, no single moment, no single cause. It was not the divorce alone. It was not the job loss alone. It was not the financial stress alone. It was the combination of all these things, filtered through a man who refused to accept responsibility, who lacked empathy, who feared shame, who believed the world owed him something. When you look at Bruce Pardo's life, you see a man who is always running from himself, from accountability, from emotional vulnerability, from the truth. He fled from his disabled son. He fled from financial responsibility. He fled from the collapse of his marriage. And when life finally cornered him, when he could no longer escape the consequences, he didn't break down. He broke outward. That is the terrifying psychology behind family annihilation. Not madness, not insanity, but entitlement, fragility. A belief that others must pay the price for one person's emotional collapse. And yet, despite all of that darkness, despite all that brutality, despite all the horror of Christmas Eve 2008, the Ortega family's legacy shines brighter. They are remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. In photographs, they are smiling. In stories, they are laughing. In the memories of those who loved them, they are whole. The fire destroyed their home, but it did not destroy their identity. It did not destroy their impact. It did not destroy the love they built. And that is why documentaries like this exist. Not merely to recount violence, but to remember the people behind the headlines. To honor the victims, not the killer. To give voice to their lives, not just their deaths. As this story closes, and as we step back from the darkness we've explored, one final thought lingers. Evil is loud, but goodness, the kind of goodness that defined the Ortega family, is louder in the long run. So when we remember this tragedy, let us not linger on the flames, or the Santa suit, or the horror. Let us remember the family. Let us remember their traditions, their laughter, their love, their unity. Let us remember the strength of those who survived, the grace of those who rebuilt, the resilience of those who refused to let hate define their story. Today we are carrying forward this question, not as a mystery, but as a reminder. What can we do as individuals, as communities, as human beings, to ensure that anger never grows into something capable of destroying so much? Because in the end, the true legacy of the Covina Christmas Massacre is not the darkness one man created. It is the light the Ortega family left behind. And it is up to all of us to keep it alive. If you found value in this deep dive into the psychology behind this tragedy, please subscribe for more long-form documentaries. Your support allows me to continue exploring the hidden motives, the human failures, and the lessons buried inside cases like this. Share your thoughts below. What part of this case stayed with you the most?